Well, let's go to live images now from the Pantheon, where the ceremony marking 40 years since France abolished the death penalty underway. Former Justice Minister Badinter speaking at the moment with the President Emmanuel Macron alongside him.
Thanks to him and his political courage, that we owe the abolition of the death penalty to, which was abolished in France in 1981. I would add another respects I'd like to pay to President Jacques Chirac, who wanted to make abolition a constitutional principle, which he did in 2007. How could I also not mention the memory of all the members of parliament from all political parties who, in the two assemblies, fought for abolition to be able to be enacted in France? And I'm thinking to Raymond Fournier, to Michel Dreyfus-Schmidt, to Bernard Stasi, to Pierre Ngba, and to Monsieur Philippe Séguin. I could name many more. When faced with a public opinion that was in majority hostile to abolition, they maintained their convictions and thus served as an example. 40 years have passed since the vote for abolishing the death penalty in France. The march towards universal abolition has since then not ceased. In 1981, we were the 36th country in the world to have abolished the death penalty. I'll add that we were also the last in the European community, which, for a country that considers itself to be the motherland of human rights, is not maybe a very good thing. But today, out of 198 UN member states, 109 have abolished the death penalty in law, 36 have abolished it in practice. And in 2020, at the UN, 123 states voted for a moratorium to executions as well. And so, rather, abolition has become a majority position among the countries of the world. In Europe, on our continent, which was ravaged for centuries by bloody crime, the death sentence has completely disappeared, except in Belarus, the last Stalinist country. Abolition has become one of the pillars of European civilization, and the European Court of Human Rights has expressed, which is the conscience of European legal conscience, has condemned the death penalty as an unacceptable form of punishment. Internationally, conventions and declarations have multiplied against the use of the death penalty. I will not give you a long list of these conventions, but I will cite only the Statute of Rome, because it is very meaningful. It dates back to 1998, and it is what created the International Criminal Court. Its mission is to judge the worst criminals on earth, crimes against humanity, and that this statute has excluded the use of the death penalty. And today, in Europe, there would not be a single magistrate who would defend the death sentence in international jurisdictions, they would refuse to be part of that. And so humanity moves forward, even if certain states, such as China, Iran, Egypt, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, but also the United States of America, which is a great republic that is a friend of France. And in these countries, there have been many sentences passed and executions. Mr. President, France owes itself and must be at the front line when it comes to the fight against the death penalty. It is not enough to have a universal moratorium on executions. We have to put an end to death sentences because we refuse that the number of thousands of people who are sentenced to death keeps growing. Among these people, there are innocents who have filled death rows for years and sometimes even decades. As long as we will hang people, gas people, decapitate people, as long as we'll stone and shoot people around the world, all of those who consider the right to live as an absolute, as a moral absolute, will have to continue their struggle. I want to share with you right now my absolute conviction that the death penalty has to disappear from this world because it is a shame for humanity. Never in any place on earth has it pushed crime back. And even worse than this, when it comes to terrorism, this scourge of our time, the death sentence would transform terrorism or terrorists into martyrs and heroes in the eyes of their supporters. And after each execution, a commando of fanatics would stand up to take revenge by committing new terrorist attacks. So in truth, the death sentence does not defend society, women, men. It dishonors them. And for this reason, we always have to refuse. And we have to do this everywhere. We have to refuse that death be made into law under the guise of justice. In places where abolition has been acquired, does this mean that our task has been carried out? Have we reached our goals? No, we have another door is open to justice once abolition is enacted because it gives life to justice. It gives life to justice, and the whole of society then must allow the convicted person to be able to have the right that Victor Hugo said, the right to be able to be a better person. How can you exercise this right if not by the modalities of sentences? We need to be able to have a transformation. We need to hope for a convicted person to be able to improve. And this can only happen thanks to this person. This might be the dreams of a blind humanism. That's what the partisans of the death sentence will say. But this is a conviction that is realistic. That is what abolitionists say, saying that convicted persons have long prison terms, but spend the time does not erase the crimes they have committed. And we must never forget the pain of the victims, their rights, and their conditions. These have to be our constant concern. As I have stated before, crime is the geometrical location of human suffering, a suffering that our society has always to be conscious of. And so we celebrate today this 40th anniversary, but it's not only the anniversary of a law for universal conscience, it's also the affirmation of the sacredness of human life within a civilization that is founded on human rights. In this Republican Pantheon, where such great defenders of abolition are laid to rest, such as Victor Hugo, Jaurès, and symbolically Condorcet, it is thus legitimate, thanks to you, to remind ourselves, long live universal abolition. Prime Minister, President of the National Assembly, Ministers, Vice President of the Council of State, Defender of Rights, dear Members of Parliament, Prefect of Paris, Prefect of the Île-de-France region, ladies and gentlemen, magistrates, Members of Parliament, dear friends, dear Robert Badinter and Madame Badinter. Thank you for these words. They are as necessary as the historic words that you said in front of the National Assembly 40 years ago. For anyone who had doubts, you have lost nothing of your ambition, of your capacity of being shocked, of your precision of mind. Thank you for this passion that has not been changed with the time. And thank you for this ambition, this strong will that is still intact. You have reminded us, and during these last days, you've reminded us of the moments that allowed you to realize what was one of the greatest struggles in your life. The courage of a candidate and then later President François Mitterrand, who announced on the 16th of March 1981 that he wanted to put an end to capital punishment. And this went against the public opinion of his time. The parliamentary debates and the decisive support that came from all different parties, Bernard Stasi, Collomb, Mr. Séguin, and so many others. But it was more than just the adoption of a piece of legislation. It was enshrining abolition in the long term. This is what you were working for. The lives that were ripped away. And because we need a justice, and a justice is fallible, and it is because it is human. Your wishes did come true. The revolution that you worked for took root within the French nation without crime increasing, as your adversaries had feared. It has become a constitutional principle since Jacques Chirac's reforms enacted in 2007. And above all, abolition has kept growing and spreading around the world. France, as you said, was the 35th country to have abolished the death penalty in 1981. But 106 countries have followed down the same path. And 50 other countries respect a moratorium either in law or in practice on executions. And Europe, which was the first to denounce this abomination, Europe is an example that really inspired you in 1981. And Europe since 2002, and it has the 13th protocol of the Convention of Human Rights, and it is now a continent without the death sentence, except for Belarus, which you have explained to us is an anachronistic example that goes against this trend. So we meet here today, 40 years later, and by doing so, we are taking our place within a history, within this history of Condorcet, who was an activist against the death penalty before the National Convention adopted it for the first time in 1795. The history of Victor Hugo, who expressed to the whole country of what the abomination of capital punishment was. The history of Jaurès, who said that the death sentence is against the spirit of Christianity and against the spirit of the revolution. Because this is the history of a struggle of conscience. There is a lesson for our entire civilization here. And so meeting here today is also choosing to choose a new struggle together, a struggle of resistance. Because in France, as in other European countries, voices that we thought were dead have come back from the past and are calling for the reinstatement of the death penalty. To those who defend this justice that kills, read the testimony of Monique Monelli, who described the last execution carried out in France, that of Amina Jandoubi, and come back and tell us if you are not touched, if you are not touched by this cold machine of the death administration. It is a very touching text, and you hung it in the National Magistrature of Bordeaux. And what this testimony says, what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights can never be. Abolition is progress of people's rights that has become part of our national tradition. Our responsibility is to protect it and to transmit it. This is a struggle of conquest, too. 483. That is the number that is probably underestimated, the number of executions that were carried out in the world in 2020. 483 state executions carried out by 33 different countries who usually share a taste for despotism, a rejection of human rights. But not only that, and you reminded us of this too, every time a woman, a man, is sentenced to death by other women, by other men, it is the universal values that are destroyed. What we are deeply, a civilization that is based on the end to violence and the primacy of the dignity of the human person. And this is what is attacked by the death sentence. Because at the very foundations of our justice system, we have this principle of reparations, this concern, this consideration towards the victims. But we also have a recognition that is done towards each citizen of recognizing their dignity and their right to become a better person. I would like to announce to you thus, on this date, the 9th of October 2021, that France will relaunch the fight for universal abolition. France, as part of France's presidency of the EU, we will organize here in France, with the organization Ensemble contre la peine de mort, against the death penalty, an organization of states and civil society, in order to try and convince the states that still have the death penalty of the urgency to abolish it. France, as you have suggested, with its partners within the EU, will present at the next General Assembly of the United Nations a draft resolution so that each year countries that have not abolished the death penalty yet reveal to the United Nations the number of death sentences that have been passed and the number of executions that have been carried out. This is a universal struggle that we will carry out as Europeans forever and always. Ladies and gentlemen, everywhere where the death sentence is carried out, barbarity dominates. Everywhere where the death sentence is rare, civilization reigns. These words are those of Victor Hugo, whose spirit you can feel in this place. The importance of the civilizational struggle that you contributed to, Mr. Robert Badinter. And France and Europe will continue this struggle with determination. Long live universal abolition, long live the Republic, and long live France. Thank you.
French President Emmanuel Macron just wrapping up a speech at the Pantheon. Speaking before him was the former Justice Minister Robert Badinter. Joining us again on the set, our international affairs commentator, Douglas Herbert. Doug, striking images, having that speech held in the Pantheon where many French icons were laid to rest, and Emmanuel Macron paying tribute to a long list of abolitionists before who fought to end the death penalty.
Yeah, Emmanuel Macron obviously is in awe of Robert Badinter, who is, in a sense, in many respects, sort of a political mentor for being the person who led this fight almost single-handedly at the time, 40 years ago, against, at a time when a lot of France was opposed to abolishing the death penalty, to bring this law about. So it was, yes, this was partially a heartfelt tribute to someone who really pushed a philosophical, a moral agenda on France and triumphed in that. And Emmanuel Macron notably said to him in French, "Vous avez été exaucé." Your wishes, you have been heard, your wishes have been fulfilled. And he was very clear that, you mentioned that Emmanuel Macron spoke about the fact that the fight against abolition didn't all of a sudden begin with Robert Badinter, even if he was at the right moment in history at the right time and really saw it through, and finally was the one who saw it to fruition legally in the abolishment. But he paid tribute to Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo, obviously a French icon, if ever there was one, who was really, I mean, he fought tooth and nails against the notion that human beings should have the right to put to death another human being. Also Jean Jaurès, a leader going back, labor socialist leader who also was iconic to many French in many ways, also fighting against it. But even some very unexpected people that weren't mentioned by Emmanuel Macron. But going back to the French Revolution, Robespierre himself was against the death penalty. And you say, but wait, Robespierre, he was a central figure. I mean, at the time of terror in France, there was even movements before the most violent parts of the French Revolution, guillotines going left and right. Even then, about 2 years before the revolution, there was a movement to abolish the death penalty. Even back then, over 200 years ago, obviously it didn't come to fruition at the time. It was far too early. It would have to wait over another 200 years. But it does show that there is a very strong and virulent strain of abolitionism against capital punishment, the death penalty, that runs through France almost in whatever era you look in. Even the president back in 1906, at the very beginning of his 7-year mandate, one of his first acts was to grant amnesty to dozens of people who had been condemned to death. So it's been around for a long time. Emmanuel Macron today basically, though, paying tribute to Robert Badinter for making it happen, but also putting it in the context, enshrining it. It wasn't just a battle for France. He also is the man who has helped to push the universal abolition agenda. And as Emmanuel Macron signed off, he basically said his final words were, "Long live universal abolition, long live the Republic, long live France." So he put universal abolition really right up there with this sort of triad of things, that the president says that he wants to see as eternal and universal. This is part of a beginning battle. What France did, becoming the 36th state to abolish the death penalty back in 1981, it's now part of an ongoing universal global battle, not just for a moratorium, but eventually to abolish it.
Yeah, Macron's saying he wants to sort of reinvigorate that fight, that universal push next year. Next year is a presidential election, of course,
Absolutely.
in France. But where does universal abolition stand at the moment?
Well, look, in a broad framework, is the death penalty about to come back in France? No. As Emmanuel Macron and others have acknowledged, France has advanced in the past several decades. There is a new zeitgeist. There is sort of an absolute, that most people do find the death penalty the anathema in many respects. But at the same time, a poll last year showed that a majority of French would favor actually bringing back the death penalty, which seems to contradict what I just said, this universal trend away from it. What happens with the death penalty, it tends to be highly charged politically. It's used in many cases by polemicists, those who want to whip up public opinion as sort of a battering rod. And among the far right, especially, it has a lot of advocates, people who want to bring it back. Among the far right in France, a recent survey showed about 85% of those who identify themselves as far right would favor reestablishing, reinstating the death penalty. Among conservative-leaning, it's slightly lower, but still a majority of conservatives, Republicans in France on the right of the spectrum would favor bringing it back. But like I said, there's been a lot of sensibility, progress, more heightened awareness about the death penalty itself. Those who have argued for abolition, always against the death penalty, have made the basic arguments that it's not just unjust, but it's ineffective. Unjust in the sense that a lot of innocent people are borne out in recent years, are convicted to death. It turns out only later, too late to undo their sentence, obviously. Ineffective, too, because one of the main arguments of those who favor it is that it deters other people from committing horrible crimes, including right up to and including murder. The statistics actually do not bear that out. In fact, the statistics suggest the death penalty does not deter any more than, say, life in prison, perhaps even less. So there are a lot of, from the abolitionist standpoint, faulty and spurious arguments being put forth by those on the right, which are very still effective, the right-wing arguments in favor of the death penalty. Why? Because we live in a world where there's a lot of insecurity, there's a lot of fear about society being protected. Those fears always come front and center at a time, as we are in right now in France, of a presidential and electoral campaign. So you can whip up public sentiment, you can fearmonger around issues of security. You hit a raw nerve with the public, and the emotions often outweigh the actual evidence and the statistics that show, no, at the end of the day, the death penalty is not effective. And at the end of the day, yes, there is an element of injustice. End of the day, those who are for abolition, and including those here in France, including Robert Badinter, basically say that the law's job, justice's job, is not to seek vengeance, The law's job is to basically try to change and reform criminals, make them better, perhaps be able to bring them back into society as useful citizens.